there are no all-stars in the Human Rights Department in Asia in general. What we see is a wide spectrum of governments with different types of rights records, but across the region, Asia still lags behind other parts of the world in terms of everything from international ratification of international human rights conventions to actual practice.
From Asia News Weekly, this is Asia Now, the podcast featuring stories and interviews from the Asia-Pacific region. Eroding personal freedoms, political oppression, and what some are saying is an overall decline in democracy. These events are all taking place throughout the region, but what is the current status of human rights in Asia? That conversation is taking place in Asia now. Hello everyone, welcome to this week's Asia Now podcast. I'm your host, Steve Miller, and I'd like to thank you so much for joining me this week. If we turn our gaze to Asia, believe it or not, 4.3 billion people live here. That's 60% of the world's population. It's also home to cruel dictatorships like North Korea, China, who performs more executions than the world combined, and other nations that seem to have a revolving door of leaders. But what is the current state of human rights here? For that, I'd like to welcome back to the program Phil Robertson. He is the Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch's Asia Division. Mr. Robertson, welcome to Asia Now.
Thank you so much for having me on the program.
Mr. Robertson, let's go ahead and begin in somewhat of general terms here. If we look at Asia, in your opinion, what countries have generally good human rights records and which ones, well, let's say they fall short?
Well, there are no all-stars in the Human Rights Department in Asia in general. What we see is a wide spectrum of governments with different types of rights records, but across the region, Asia still lags behind other parts of the world in terms of everything from international ratification of international human rights conventions to actual practice. And Human Rights Watch, as a matter of practice, doesn't really engage in comparison about who is better and worse, because our view is if you're getting tortured, it doesn't really matter whether you're in Laos or North Korea or Cambodia, it's still wrong. You know, we, I guess, can probably divvy up the countries in the region based on degrees. But, I think there are different systems. And, some of the countries are really totalitarian and that allowing no freedom of expression or public assembly. I'm putting in that basket would be like North Korea, Vietnam and Laos, perhaps Brunei. Some countries allow some limited space for human rights activists or civil society groups to operate, but within very strict limits. Countries like China, Thailand now, with a new military government here as of last year, Burma. And then there are other countries where, they're democratic ostensibly, but there are still a lot of rights abuses taking place. And in this basket, I would put countries like Malaysia, Singapore, and the Philippines. We have hope that some countries will get better. Indonesia with the new president, Jokowi, offers some hope for some significant human rights improvements. But within Indonesia, there's a lot of local problems, religious discrimination against women, and certainly the whole problem of West Papua that have yet to be addressed. So it's a real mixed bag, and one which keeps us very busy. I actually joke with friends that I'm in a growth business because, unfortunately, the rights abuses in Asia continue to grow.
Now, you brought up Thailand just a moment ago, so let's go ahead and stay there. As you mentioned, the coup took place in May of last year, about 10 months ago. Have we seen any kind of improvement in the human rights records since Prayut has taken control of the country?
We're not, to be frank. The one thing that we hold out hope for is the pledges that Prime Minister Prayut made on a recent trip to Japan, that there would be a return to democracy by sometime early in 2016, or at even perhaps the last days of 2015. I think a restoration of democracy here in an end of martial law is really critical to turn the human rights situation around. But on a day-to-day basis, There's still, censorship, going after individual dissidents, trying to control the media, all the things that really raise serious concerns about which way Thailand is heading on a human rights basis. Another issue, of course, is also the draft constitution, which is being prepared by a constitutional drafting committee of the National Legislative Assembly. This, I think, may be a Pandora's box of bad human rights ideas, but we haven't seen the full picture yet because that drafting is taking place behind closed doors.
And along those same lines, we've seen coups, we've seen protests, we've seen general unrest throughout the region. And I wanted to get your opinion on this. Is there any particular country or any particular part of Asia that we've seen a decidedly decrease in the amount of human rights that are available to the citizens living there?
Well, I think we're seeing some of the most severe crackdown on human rights in China in the past 10 years. Xi Jinping has been going after dissidents and activists in a more concerted way than we've seen in a long, long time. And as we saw, for instance, on International Women's Day earlier this month, women who are simply distributing leaflets or putting up posters, are arrested, kept in detention, denied access to lawyers. We're seeing an ongoing crackdown, against activists, who the government views as criminals rather than seeing them as potential allies to help in solving, political, social, and economic problems that plague China.
Well, that brings up a very good question. Where exactly does China fall on the spectrum of human rights in general?
Well, it's a problematic country. It's one that is projecting bad human rights practice into the international scene. You have bad practices of Chinese investors in places like Africa, abusing people connected to projects and violating labor rights. You have, China working very hard at the UN General Assembly and in Geneva at the Human Rights Council to blunt or to reverse human rights progress. You have China supporting rights abusive regimes in other countries. It is unfortunately a very negative influence for human rights around the world, and a major challenge in the work of the international human rights movement.
When looking at China, we typically discuss three primary areas in terms of protests, human rights violations. We look at Xinjiang, we look at Beijing, and of course, recently we look at Hong Kong with the pro-democracy movements. Comparing those three areas, which one is the most problematic?
Well, we've done the most work really on Xinjiang and the crackdown that has happened against the minority ethnic Uyghurs, which are a Muslim minority in China. In the name of counterterror, there's been wholesale sweeps against Uyghurs. And that has prompted a major flight of Uyghurs from the region, people who have been coming through Thailand and Malaysia to escape to other parts of the world. We have right now in Thailand here a group of over 300 Uyghurs who have essentially been held for almost 10 months, trying to get to a third country, and they are facing, possible return to China. That's a very, very serious concern. It would be a case of revolving, sending people back to an area where they could be prosecuted. So, China, when in pursuing this situation in Xinjiang, there, of course, has been violence, and no one condones violence that has been perpetrated by individuals against innocent civilians, whether they be Uyghurs or whether they be Han Chinese. But the thing is, the government's response has been excessive and certainly caused a great deal of outcry around the world about what is happening in Xinjiang.
Not too long ago, Human Rights Watch issued the World Report 2015, in which it urged President Aquino to take decisive action against torture and extrajudicial killings by the police and other state security forces. I was wondering if you could briefly describe what the report uncovered and what can be done about it.
Well, the Philippines, it's been sort of one step forward and one step back there. Certainly, we've seen a decrease of cases of extrajudicial killings by police and other security forces over the 4 years that President Aquino has been in power. He, of course, ran on a agenda of human rights and saying that he was going to be something new and different. But the problem is that activists, journalists, human rights lawyers continue to be gunned down with impunity. Every month sees a handful of new cases, of people being shot down, by people on motorcycle, driving past their car or shooting them in front of their house. And, in many cases, you dig deeper and those persons are uncovering some sort of corruption or some sort of official malfeasance or have been connected by the military with leftist groups. And this is being used as an excuse to target them. And the major problem here is impunity, that at the end of the day, very few security forces or police are ever held accountable for involvement in such extrajudicial killings. And that's what we've uncovered. I mean, it's not a secret in the Philippines. I mean, this is happening on a day-to-day basis. The problem is that, the government, despite its rhetoric, is not stepping up the way it needs to really put an end to this problem.
Before we go, if we could, let's see if we can find a little silver lining. Are there any countries here in the Asia-Pacific region that are making some positive gains in terms of human rights?
Well, I mean, I would have actually put in that basket South Korea just a couple months ago. But the more we dig into South Korea's situation here, the more we see abuses of the national security law. So one is concerned about how the situation is going in even a clear democracy where there is a degree of serious respect for human rights. I mean, power is still abused to violate rights, and that's sort of what we see as a trend across the region. That often elites are taking power, and in the course of taking power are sort of bringing their cronies in, and there's a process of enrichment connected to holding power, which then creates a zero-sum dynamic where in the politics, they feel that if they lose power to anyone, they will face prosecution and possibly jail, and we are seeing anybody who is seen as raising concerns about social reform, economic reform, political reform, gets targeted as a dissident, gets targeted as someone to be arrested, for instance, like sedition in Malaysia, or brought in front of a court for scandalizing the judiciary in Singapore. It's a major problem that the elites use law and power to essentially abuse rights and perpetuate their rule, and that's a major problem. Now, back to your question, I would say in places like Indonesia, where we've seen a real break in change of the sort of people who are in power. The election of Jokowi as president of Indonesia, a man coming from a modest background, someone who made his name as a reformer in local government, winning over, a prominent member of a political family, someone who had been involved in the politics and the army, that I think gave people in Indonesia a great deal of hope that the situation may be different. We hope that Jokowi will live up to his promise and will, accept and promote human rights in the region. But, the most recent evidence, connected to possible execution of prisoners that are on death row for drug-related crimes, I think it's giving everybody in the international human rights movement a pause about Jokowi. Is he really the sort of rights reformer that many people hoped he was? And right now, the jury is still out.
Phil Robertson is Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch's Asia Division. Thank you so much for taking the time out this week to join me.
Thank you very much, Steve, for having me on the show.
Well, you've heard our discussion, and now I'd like to hear from you. Do you live in Asia? Do you work in Asia? Do you travel throughout the region? What do you see as a current status of human rights throughout the Asia-Pacific region? What direction do you see it going in? I'd love to hear from you, so please leave a comment, leave a video reply, leave an audio reply, or simply respond via Facebook or Twitter. Don't forget you can keep up with more news from the region by following Asian News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter. You can even send an email to the show with your questions, your comments, and your feedback. Drop a line to podcast@asiannewsweekly.net. If you liked today's show, please share it with your friends. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to the podcast. It's absolutely free. You can do that on our website, asiannewsweekly.net, or in your favorite podcast application. Well, my friends, that is it for me today. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Steve Miller, reminding you to be true to yourself and always be awesome.